Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling from or linking online from in the world. I'm Dr. Timiobi Aganaba. You can call me Timmy. I'm an assistant professor at the School for the Future of Innovation in Society, where we believe that the future is for everyone. And this is at Arizona State University in the USA. My purpose today is to moderate a discussion between Mark Mulholland and Stuart Bain. Now, why is this such a big deal and why did I agree to this? Well, Mark is currently a MITRE employee serving as the chief engineer for space traffic management and space situational awareness at the Office of Space Commerce at the US Department of Commerce. Now, he has 44 years of government and private sector experience in design, acquisition, launch, on-orbit operations, space situational awareness, space debris mitigation. Like, I could go on and on and on. He is an innovative problem solver, strategic thinker, fiscal planner, articulate diplomat, and consensus builder at the highest levels of the Department of Commerce, NOAA, NASA, the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and the international space sectors. So we're really going to enjoy his comments and insights today. We also have with us Stuart Bain. Stuart Bain is the CEO and co-founder of North Star Earth and Space, a Canadian company that is developing an information service company to help protect life on Earth and in space. Now, this discussion today will begin to examine the threats and the opportunities of space. We will then examine some tough questions and through the experiences of both Stuart and Mark, we will try and carve out a narrative about how we can collectively develop space sustainability. And some of those tough questions that we'll ask will be, how will we manage the commercial domination of space and achieve a pathway towards sustainability? How will current technologies, innovation, regulatory frameworks, and norms of behavior evolve to meet the growing challenges for the commercial space realm? Now, COVID-19 showed us the extent of the digital divide problem. Those connected were able to maintain business or find new opportunities and continue their education. And those who were not, whether in the rural areas, indigenous communities, or developing countries, found themselves further marginalized. So proponents argue that it is cheaper and faster to use low Earth orbit satellites to bring to the world's population into the 21st century. Now, is this a good vision for the future? Will billions actually be connected and benefit from all the satellites in space? What are the challenges to get to that future? If we don't have sustainability at the heart of our practices, then we could go down a path that we have seen before here on Earth that led to climate change. In fact, with a business as usual situation, we may not even be able to fully benefit from what space has to offer. So what exactly is so critical and important about space? I mean, according to the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs, over 11,000 space objects have been launched and recorded in their online index since 1957. And these objects include satellites which cover the entire Earth's surface, including highly isolated, hard to reach areas. So satellite applications are digital services and products that rely partly on data from Earth observation satellites, telecommunication satellites, and navigation satellites. So we're going to talk about these applications. We're going to talk about the benefits that come from, space and how we can all be connected in the future. But I would like to start off by welcoming these wonderful gentlemen and basically asking my first question. So Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson are just some of the individuals that have inspired this new optimism for space. And they cite various reasons for space travel. I'd like to know what got you interested in space and how do you think that has impacted the views that you have today and the way you go about your business? Let's start with you, Mark.
Okay, thank you, Timiobi, and I'll start with the usual disclaimers that my remarks are my own and don't reflect either of my employers necessarily. But to answer your question, the person who inspired me was Walter Cronkite. And I remember watching him describe in detail all of the early human spaceflight missions. I remember him going to the factories and sitting in the capsules and asking the chief engineer what happens if I push this button, or for them to fire their retro rockets, they have to pull this. And I think Walter brought a whole generation of us along, and where we got really excited about the exploration. We really got excited with the rockets and the moon landings. But I think it also helped me to develop an immense respect for just how hard space travel is, and especially human space travel. So I guess in a lot of ways, Walter was kind of our generation's Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or Richard Branson.
And I guess for those of you who are not from America and don't know Walter Cronkite, maybe you could say who he actually was.
Well, he was probably the most well-known television and print journalist of his era. He and a bunch of his contemporaries were actually war correspondents in World War II that were embedded with U.S. forces in Europe. So I guess that really helped to build my respect for him, because he flew on bombing missions in B-17s and put himself at risk to be able to get the story.
Yes, and it's really fascinating that individuals have such an important role to play in this. And I think today's heroes are the entrepreneurs. So that's why it's really interesting, the work that you do, Stuart. And maybe you can tell us about what your inspiration was and how you got into space.
Part of it, I don't think I had much of a choice in. When I look back, I was born in Montreal on October the 4th. Not the same year, but October the 4th is International Space Day. It's the day that they launched the first satellite into space, Sputnik. And I was old enough or young enough at the time to be able to remember Neil Armstrong walking down the ladder for what to me felt like was the middle of the night, but it was actually just, before midnight when Neil walked down the ladder and uttered the famous words before he put his foot on the moon. I had a model of a Saturn V rocket in my bedroom, and fast forward when I finished being the chief engineer on the RadarSat-1 mission for building the actual structure of the RadarSat-1 antenna here in Canada. I gave my father a poster of that of the RadarSat satellite artist's rendition, and I included in the bottom corner of it a little picture of me standing beside my Saturn rocket. And I said to my father on Christmas, "Thanks for teaching me that anything's possible." I think that space for me gave me the belief that, as John F. Kennedy said at Rice University 3 weeks before I was born, on September the 12th, that we will go to the moon because it is hard, because it will bring out the best in us to be able to achieve this goal. And that taught me a lesson that if you stay focused and you try hard enough and you believe in what you're doing, you can achieve your objectives. And I think for me, space is synonymous with that type of determination and focus.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And that's so fascinating, because for me, I started my career at the Nigerian Space Agency. And, when you tell people you work at the Nigerian Space Agency, the first thing everyone is going to say is, we don't even have electricity. I mean, what are we doing going to space? And so it was really a fascinating thing to really discover, okay, what are these benefits from space? Who gets to benefit? And what does it even mean that this is something for humanity? So that leads me to really asking you guys, and maybe we'll start with Mark, over the course of your career, how have you seen the evolution of the space sector? What are we really seeing now that is different from, back in the 60s?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think when things started out, it was all about exploration. It was all about pushing the envelope. And that grew out of the early era of the space program that consisted of, let's launch it and see if it works. And even launching it at that time was difficult. You didn't know if you were going to make it to orbit or to the bottom of the ocean. So from there, we discovered that, hey, we can watch what's going on the Earth from space, and we can do weather forecasting and severe storm predictions a whole lot easier from space than basically launching balloons on the ground. So the early days, I kind of characterize it as a combination of exploration and science. And then the next sector that came along was the communication sector, and that, I think, started the addition of space as a domain to be used and exploited. And I remember the very first broadcast of Huntley Brinkley, which were a pair of U.S. news reporters on television that were contemporaries of Walter Cronkite. And they used to do a news show they called the Huntley Brinkley Report. Well, one of the first communication satellite was in the Telstar series, and I think it was number 2 because number 1 failed. And they did the news that night. One of them was in New York City, and the other one was in Paris. And they acted like they were both in the same room just to demonstrate the ability of a communication satellite to basically connect Europe with North America at that time. So then the use of space for services really exploded, I think, with the PNT systems, with GPS and others. So now we're to the point where what we're doing to explore space among the nations has really taken a back seat to space as a domain to be used for all sorts of services.
Mm-hmm. And I think, Stuart, I mean, taking it further from, so we started off thinking about exploration. We then went into services, which I think a lot of people forget sometimes because they feel like those services just started now. But with the satellite communication from the 90s, we started having services. But where is it really different now from that commercialization standpoint? And would you class yourself as this new space era?
I think we're all the new space era because we're all in it together. I would say 2 words for me describe the space industry or the space challenges right now is that it's ubiquitous and it's existential. The good thing about space is if you have access to the internet, or if you have access to financial transactions, or if you're doing any kind of activity with your car or online, you're most likely running through a satellite service, and it's ubiquitous. You didn't know that. And that's a great service. I mean, that's the ultimate service, is to say that you're you're facilitating everyday life. And the ubiquity of that is important. And anybody who contributes to keeping that running is important. That's part of North Star's role. The environment that we use in space is essential to be able to keep delivering those services. The other word, existential, in that, it's existential to our economy, and it's existential to our planet, that we keep monitoring space, keep monitoring Earth from space, climate change, monitoring environmental impacts, keeping track of how we're taking care of our crops and our water quality and everything. That information coming from space is existential for us. And so those 2 things combined have become part of the fabric of what I think commercial space is now. And the role of North Star, I think, is an essential one, as there is in a positive way, an exploding amount of activity going on in space. There's a complement to that in the yin yang of it all that says you must be able to preserve the environment. You must be able to make sure that environment is accessible for future generations and for this generation, to make sure that we can continue to safely and sustainably exploit that immeasurably valuable resource that we are accessing right now.
I mean, and Mark, you've worked in government, you've worked for the private sector. How do you think the public interact and engage with this? Like, do they know about this, and why not if they don't?
Well, I think as Stuart mentioned, I think people take space for granted, and when they use Waze or Google Maps or something to go from point A to point B, most people have no idea that they're talking to multiple GPS satellites to get there. And from a guy who spent his whole career in space, that's okay. I mean, I don't need to be, grabbing people by the collar and saying, don't you know that was a satellite that got you from point A to point B? And I think that most people identify national space agencies with exploration, whether it's NASA or the European Space Agency or JAXA or several others, and it helps from time to time with one's perspective, just to pull up the NASA pages where they have stored all the imagery of the other planets. And that really kind of, I think, centers you on what we're all about here on planet Earth, and just how we're a speck in the sky for the most part. And I think too that with the Earth science from space, you listen to a colleague of mine who's the director of the National Weather Service, and he will tell you, and has told people, that in order for me to predict tornadoes in Oklahoma on Tuesday, I need to know what the weather is on Friday over China. And the only way you can do that is with a satellite.
And it's fascinating, that I saw that half of the essential climate variables, so the measurements that we use to measure climate change, actually can only be monitored from space. And of course, that is a global service that everyone needs to benefit from. And at this point, I just want to give a shout out to Jesse and Binster in the audience. Please add your comments, any questions that you may have, we're going to be happy to answer them. So keep those coming. So at this point, I think what I'm thinking about is really, because people don't understand how reliant we are on space, they don't realize some of the challenges that we're actually facing to maintain the sustainability of space activities. And so at this point, I wanted to ask you guys if you can tell us, maybe starting from you, Mark, because I know at the Department of Commerce, you have this interesting dual role where you're trying to promote the industry, but you're trying to see what kind of safeguards you can put in place to ensure that, commerce doesn't override everything. So what are you guys seeing from the Department of Commerce standpoint, from the engagement with new actors like North Star, et cetera?
Well, I think one of the benefits we have in the Department of Commerce is that industry comes and talks to us, and I'm always amazed at the really innovative and good ideas. And they aren't really looking to get a contract with us, because in fact we don't do that, but they're just looking for help. How can they plug into the broader space community? Can they apply for grants, and that sort of thing? And then there's other companies that are more mature space operators and SSA providers that come in and talk to us about the latest things that they're doing and how they view it will help space flight safety, or it will help innovation in terms of spacecraft. And one of the unique things, I think, in the U.S. that when we go abroad is hard for a lot of countries to understand, especially regulators, is that virtually all of our standards start from the bottom up. And in a lot of countries, the standards get dictated from the top down. So for example, I would say that it was Northrop Grumman, by the 2 mission extension vehicle missions so far, have pretty much set the standards and the best practices for rendezvous and proxops and cooperative satellite servicing. And so we're always open to those good ideas. We're always open to promoting best practices, and that also helps, I think, with transparency that really needs to happen as space becomes more and more crowded.
And I think you mentioned an acronym there, which everyone might not be aware of what it means, but Space SSA. Can you tell us a bit about that? And then that can lead into Stuart talking about the capabilities that North Star have.
Yeah, well, I think it's actually pretty good. Stuart and I have been talking for 20 minutes, and this is the first time we used an acronym.
You've done well.
Yeah, we have. Yeah, it's the whole enterprise of space situational awareness, and that involves accurately tracking space objects, whether they're active satellites or debris objects, and it encompasses all orbit regimes from low Earth orbit to medium to geostationary, and even into the growing cislunar region, which is basically anything above the geostationary belt. So once you observe objects and you're satisfied that you accurately know where they are, then you start crunching all that data through computers to develop various safety of flight products, like you predict close approaches, and then that leads into the third part of it, which is where the operators get involved in managing their constellations. And if a close approach is really close, they may consider a collision avoidance maneuver if their satellite can maneuver. So that's basically in the whole realm of space situational awareness, and a closely related acronym called space traffic management.
And I think, Stuart, maybe you can tell us what are the gaps in the current system that you think that North Star is going to be able to fill with respect to space situational awareness?
I think it's a natural gap. We've always innovated faster than we've regulated, and maybe for good reason. We have a voracious appetite to do new things and explore new things and deliver new services and bring new technologies to bear. It's a very proactive cycle that we've demonstrated over history. What North Star has tried to do in the context of that is essentially digitalize space and fill the gap from this perspective of, as Erasmus of Rotterdam said in the 1500s, the philosopher, he said, innovation does not come from reason, but from lucid visionary folly. There is two components of innovation: the reason or the rational part, the engineering part that the aerospace engineers like myself or the programmers and designers all understand. You have a rational capability, which is to digitize something. But to digitalize something is to actually, for me, put it into an application. And that's the lucid visionary folly. That's what's the connection between having a digital 3D map of all of space, which is what North Star is uniquely capable of doing. We can see all orbits: low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, geostationary orbit, highly elliptical, and parts of cislunar through our space-based sensors. And we can digitalize that into a form where there is an application for that, so that satellite operators can effectively navigate through the debris in space and prevent further collisions. What we need to do in space right now is innovate the technology as fast on how we will navigate through space as we will in occupying the space. And we had the same problem with highway traffic. We had the same way back in the day, and we had the same problem in the 1950s with air traffic control. This is now the next level and generation of that, and I think the Department of Commerce and what Mark has been a part of, and his predecessors have been a part of, in establishing space traffic management and putting a framework around that in concert with commercial enterprise. We've passed the point where space is dominated by governments. It's now being dominated by commercial enterprise. So commercial enterprise needs to innovate, and entrepreneurs need to come to the front to provide options, solutions. And that's, maybe to answer your question, where North Star fits in. We bring in an option for regulators, we bring in an option for operators, we bring in an option for insurance companies to say, that hole that went through the Canadarm on the International Space Station came from what exactly? And when's the next one coming from? And if you don't know the answer to that question, you better figure it out in a hurry if you want to keep launching satellites to the point where you're going to have, as they predict, over 100,000 operational satellites by the end of this decade. We need to innovate and expand and roll in an entrepreneurial way as fast as possible on getting information up and running on that front. And North Star wants to lead the way on that.
Mm-hmm. That's really, really interesting. And I think really, I mean, for people to understand that since 1957, we've only had, well, not only, but we've had 11,000 objects in space. That's like over 60 years. And in this matter of 10 years, that could increase by like fivefold. So that's really like, we have a lot of work to do to make sure that it's not going to be chaos. So what is the role of government, Mark, here? Because yes, the innovators need to start providing solutions, but space is still pretty big and pretty international. This is a big problem. Government has a big role to play. What is the US government doing, for instance? Mark.
Mm-hmm. Well, the art of regulation really is an art. You want to make, whatever you're regulating, you want to make it safe and you want to make it accessible to the public, but you don't want to over-regulate the industry to the point where they run offshore to perhaps a country that isn't really big into regulation at all. So it's basically a blend of government regulations when it's appropriate and pulling together like-minded space operators, whether it's government or industry or a combination of both, and you sit down and develop best practices. You sit down and say, okay, in order for me to fly safely, I really need to know this information from you, and vice versa, and that basically expands into industry accepted best practices. And I look back on probably the best example was way back, I think in the 1930s, Daimler-Benz with his cars in Germany had developed the crushable frame. And when they realized how many lives that would save, he was being pushed by some in his company that wanted to keep that technology proprietary. And it was Daimler-Benz himself that said, no, we really owe this to the rest of the world because of all the lives that it'll save. And certainly there's opportunities right now for one or two of commercial space operators to step forward and to be the Daimler-Benz of the space age, I think.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I want to give a big shout out to Shitan Jushu. Thank you for joining us and for giving us your comments. Keep those questions coming. I'm going to get to them. I think this really leads into a fascinating question that Scott is asking. So thanks, Scott, for your question. He's asking whether we think that we need global regulations or standards. I mean, I think both clearly here you guys understand the role of innovation and regulating or not over-regulating. But I mean, to Scott's question, if this is a global issue, do we need global regulation? What do you think? What do you think, Stuart?
Yeah. Okay. I would say let's think about learning from history, because I'm a big buff on that, and think about William Forster Lloyd in 1833. In England, that wrote an essay about the tragedy of the commons. And I'll explain what the tragedy of the common is as briefly as I can. In England, or in Britain, at the time, common lands were allowed to be grazed by anyone who felt the need. So livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, anything was allowed to graze on the common lands, but nobody owned it. It wasn't anybody's land. And what happened was, the commons ended up being overgrazed and absolutely destroyed. Not just one, but all of the commons were destroyed. And the tragedy of the commons was that the private lands were well protected, but the commons were not well protected. Einstein said that the consciousness that created the problem cannot be used to solve the problem. So we have a problem in space. We have overcongestion. We have growing congestion. We have a voracious appetite to keep populating space, and we need to solve that problem through innovation. And the consciousness that created that problem cannot solve it. And the tragedy of the commons is that we cannot allow that to repeat. So a global system means, in this case, we all really own space, because it's not like cleaning up an accident, unfortunate accident on the highway or an air traffic accident. Things in space move quickly, but things in space move very slowly. An accident in space leaves debris in its orbit for decades, and you cannot clean it up the way you clean up an unfortunate accident anywhere else. We need to get collectively together to understand we all own this space, and we all must learn from history and those lessons learned from history to work together. But I think the solution, like it or not, is led by commercial enterprise, because it needs to go quickly. It needs to move faster than governments can move, not to force governments to move faster than they're able to, but to lead the way, as we've led the way in exploiting the low Earth orbit. Because what we're really talking about now is low Earth orbit and the explosion of activity in low Earth orbit. And in that area, we're deficient in sensors, we're deficient in knowledge, and we're deficient in being able to predict what's happening in the near-term future. So that we need to be able to get to that point commercially. And then with that information, as the Japanese proposed at Davos in 2018, we put humans at the center of an information-driven society. We use information to benefit ourselves, to save ourselves from our own problems that we create. And governments, I think at this point, will play a role in two things. They will adopt the technology for creating good policy and regulation, but that will not lead the way. But they will also encourage, as much as possible, that innovation to continue. They will be customers of that data, or they will support the research and development of that information service, and they will facilitate globally, collectively, the ability to address these extremely large challenges that are facing us right now.
That's a fascinating insight. And, you know, I'm a lawyer who worked for the government. So, you know, I'm always very afraid, like all these risk-averse lawyers are, when we say move fast, right? Because I know that law can't keep pace, but we get very afraid of innovation, because if you let innovators loose, you know, you don't know where it's going to go. And that is very fascinating, because if you look at the chat and you look at the questions, that's the concern that people have. So Sean is saying, you know, on the flip side of the global question, you know, from North Star's perspective, does Canada need to pass a new space law? So people are really concerned that innovation shouldn't outpace the legal regime. What are your thoughts on space law? Let's get into the tough stuff.
I'll jump in and let Mark go afterwards. I want to give a shout out to the fact that, regardless of political persuasion, if I can say that as a disclaimer, the space policy directives of the United States, I think, set a standard for the world. It doesn't matter what administration created them. That what really matters is it set a tone, it set a message, and it was very clear statements about what needs to address. Were they perfect? No. Was any document written perfect over history? But they were very clear directives that I think every country needs to think about individually and collectively, and the United Nations as well, about the sustainability of space requires a focus. And as a high-ranking military person said to me here in Canada that was in charge of space for Canada, in the absence of strategy, everything is a good idea, which means nothing gets done. So we need focus. I think when you think about innovation, when you think about entrepreneurial spirit, when you think about anything you're doing in concert or alone with the government or without the government, you need to have a focus. North Star's focus is the environment. We're environmentalists, and I want to preserve space as environment for my 6 kids and their children's children. I want to make sure that they have access to the same excitement that I had access to from the time I was a kid. And that means I'm an environmentalist that's looking at solutions to be delivered to help solve that problem. That's not a regulatory position. That's provide tools that can solve problems in real time. And of course, the government will always be there. And so space law, absolutely. We have a fantastic department here at McGill. Ram Jaku and the team at McGill are world experts in space law. And I think that follows. But when you give the governments and the experts and the space law experts the appropriate tools to say, we really know where all the debris is, we really know where all the, we call it resident space objects are, and we are tracking them effectively. So what will this mean in terms of what we really should put in place for properly managing our activities? And it flows naturally. We don't put necessarily the rules before we have the tools. So I think that's a bit of a shift, because we do have to get out in front of the problem. We can't afford to clean up space. Back to my previous comment. Once the debris has been created, it's there for a long time. We can't allow it to happen. We got to get innovation out in front of it.
What do you have to say on that, Mark?
Yeah, I was just beginning to talk about an example out of maritime law, in that the Japanese freighter that broke loose after the tsunami in Japan had basically drifted as a hazard to navigation out into the Pacific, and it got close enough to Alaska, where I think it was the Canadian Coast Guard went out and sank it to remove the hazard to navigation. But you try to do that in space, even if you had an active debris removal system capable of doing that. And the original Outer Space Treaties still dictate that the launching state owns the space object in forever, basically.
Yes.
So going back to the freighter example, is that Japan never said, "Don't you dare sink my ship, Canada," or "That's an act of war," and nobody cared whether it was the Canadian Coast Guard or the U.S. Coast Guard or anybody else that went out and removed the hazard to navigation, because in the tragedy of the Commons, it was the right thing to do. So I mean, that's an example of just one aspect of where the legal system in space hasn't kept up at all with current operations.
And I think, I mean, if we look at it, so the Outer Space Treaty, which is the Constitution of Space that was established in the 1950s, was really meant to be a framework, a broad principles. There should be non-appropriation of space. You should rescue astronauts. They couldn't really envision what kind of activities were going to come down the line 50 years later. But we're at this crossroads now because people are afraid of trying to open up new regimes, right? Because now we have over 100 countries, who are signatories. We have 70 space agencies. If we try to open up the treaty, we may never close it again, right? So that's where we have these non-binding norms and et cetera that are now coming in. And this leads me to a great question from Shitanzu, where he's saying, well, what would be the standards or pillars for sustainable development of space projects? So how, Stuart, maybe you've thought about this. How do we conceptualize thinking about sustainability of space objects moving forward?
The sustainability relies on having the tools to be able to do it and having the will to be able to use and implement those tools. And it has to come from everybody in terms of their own decisions. You can't enforce that. And I don't think regulatory is the right way to enforce it. I think everybody needs to see the need to step up and do the right thing. And let's give an example of how that's worked in history. Abraham Lincoln said, in the time of crisis, most people will stand up and to the situation and do the right thing. But if you really want to know the true character of a person, give them power. That's an interesting point to reflect on. But what's really important is that we need to think about Apollo 13. When Apollo 13 was going through their crisis in space, 12 nations looked at the situation collectively together and said, I've come up with a possible solution. Here's what you could do. An astronaut in space looking back at Earth, regardless of whatever country launched them, is a human being that's gone into space. And when you look back at space, at Earth from space, that's home base. We're all from there. And we start with that problem and we all say, let's figure out the answer. So collectively in space, in the International Space Station historically, and all throughout space, we've collectively, and I think now we are facing, I would say, a crisis in space. The congestion level in space and the activity in space, and I would say the whole in the Canadarm2 on the International Space Station is the proverbial canary in the coal mine. It's time to wake up and take action. And we all can see the problem. And innovation has a role to play. Entrepreneurs have a role to play. Users and operators have a role to play, and governments have a role to play. Because as you pointed out to me at the beginning of this, space is ubiquitous. We're all using it every day. We're all accessing it. We're all benefiting from it, whether we know it or not. And so we have a common problem, and we can face it together and solve the problem together. That's my perspective on that.
So I'd love to. So my answer to this might be a controversial one, and I'd love to get you guys' thoughts on this. And it's really about, is it time we start seeing the space environment as a human environment? Now, the reason this is controversial is because it's pretty clear that people see space as a domain, right? It's a domain of operations. When we look at what the United Nations have been negotiating with respect to sustainability, they negotiated long-term sustainability of space activities. So that means they're trying to protect activities. They're not looking at space as an environment. And if we try to say apply rules from Earth law into space, it would have to be because we see space as an Earth environment, as a human environment. What do you guys think about that? Is it feasible, and what are the implications? Stuart.
Well, let's start with simple things that we can digest together. I'm not an expert on law or space law, but I am an aerospace engineer, and I do run a company that wants to protect the environment. What are we trying to solve? So let's set up the boundary conditions, as an engineer might say. The space that we're talking about is not Star Trek. It's not Star Wars. It's not interplanetary travel. It's near Earth orbit, which is a definable volume of space. It's 300 trillion cubic kilometers of space that encircles the Earth that we use. That's a big number, 300 trillion cubic kilometers, but it's a finite number, and it's a finite resource, and you cannot overexploit it. So within those boundaries, we need to define our behaviors and activities. And I think that when you look at it as a finite resource with the problems and the congestion that are growing inside it, we can all agree that we need to find a technical and a regulatory and a law activity that will resolve that. And commercial has a role to play. Governments have a role to play. Governments should do what industry cannot do, which is talk to other governments and get a collective thought going forward in terms of how we will work on this and agree to this together. Industry can't make that happen. What industry can do is give government the tools to be able to intelligently address those situations as best as possible. And space law follows and plays a very important role of saying, we've agreed that with these tools and with these policies, these shall be the rules, and they will evolve as we evolve. And that handshake or that collective work is something that takes, as Kennedy said, the best in all of us to make it happen. We have to be our best in space, because we cannot, and I'm saying it again, clean it up. We have to prevent the mess from happening. And so we've got to get out in front.
And that's fascinating, saying that space brings out the best in us, because it leads me to Binster's question, where he's asking, how do we ensure that this sector is responsible and that all humans can benefit and have access to services from space in the long term? So what are your thoughts on that, Mark?
Well, I think expanding on what Stuart was talking about, I think it's a combination, and there are certainly best practices and guidelines out there, and probably the easiest thing is to make sure you can safely dispose of your spacecraft after the mission is done, and that doesn't clean up anything in terms of space debris, but it ensures that you don't create more by leaving dead satellites and rocket bodies and other objects up there. So I think that's a good place to start. I think another aspect is in the area of communications, and to develop new technologies and to work on things like software-defined radios, where you can automatically ensure that your uplink and downlink can go where it needs to go without interfering with anyone else. So I think I think what governments can do is that sooner or later you have to launch your satellite, which means you are probably getting a launch license from somebody, and that's a choke point where whoever issues the launch license can say, okay, do you have a disposal plan? Have you registered your frequencies? Have you done an analysis to make sure that no pieces of your spacecraft or your rocket are going to hit the Earth and not burn up? So I think there's a couple of convergences of all of the roads, but I think industry again will be out front, because if you plan on orbiting and flying 30,000 CubeSats in a single orbit regime, if nothing else for your own business model, you're going to make sure that you keep it as clean as possible.
But of course, yes, that important role of industry is there, but importantly for government, we cannot have flags of convenience. And by flags of convenience, what we mean is that, some, if there's not like a minimum standard, then some innovators might try and look for where it's easiest. And in this context, that doesn't help anyone, right? So there's a responsibility for us all to get educated on what these standards should be, what they are, and how we can ensure that everyone follows them. So we've been talking a lot about the U.S. perspective and Canadian perspective, and I'm giving a shout out here to Kane Dave. It looks like he must be from Nigeria, and he's asking, how can we open up space activities more, to less powerful states or to, non-traditional actors? And the interesting thing here to highlight is that of the over 80 countries who are like investing in space, half of them actually are developing countries. So we're seeing accessibility increase, right? But maybe you guys can speak a little bit more to this issue of how do we make space an inclusive place, an environment where everybody is welcome?
I'll start with the concept, and bring me back to the point if I get too far away from it, but it makes me think I need to digress just a little bit in respect of the question, that you start with the question, who cares? Who cares? Who cares in space? The people that have the most to lose. Who has the most to lose in space? The biggest space companies, the biggest space countries, the biggest users of space have the most to lose. So let's just trust the fact they care. They care if space is not accessible. They care if space is not sustainable. They want it to be there for future use. So they're motivated. So as a former hockey coach of my kids, I study a lot motivation. If you've got a lot to lose, you're motivated. You're motivated to make sure it stays there. And that speaks to sustainability. And then when I come in as a commercial, or North Star comes in, I should say, as a commercial option for information services to protect the space environment, then what you have is an opportunity to protect that environment that benefits others. How developing countries will develop themselves to access space is beyond my pay grade. But most importantly, what I want to do is make sure that those countries will at least have an environment that is accessible. And so I bring it back to that point. I care as an industrialist, as an entrepreneur, to preserve the environment of space. If that space environment is effectively preserved, then the time it takes, which may be tomorrow, it may be in 10, 20 years, for developing countries to have their own access to space, it's theirs to access. And I think that's an important point. The show's still going on. The concert's still playing. You can still hear the music. It's not over. I think it's really important that we think about it in a temporal manner and let the countries have the opportunities to access space.
Any comments, Mark?
Yeah, I'll just add quickly that through my work on the U.S. delegation at UN COPUOS, there's about 90 member countries now. And there are quite a few of the 90 that don't even fly satellites. And while everybody is really happy when a country for the first time flies a CubeSat on as a ride share, the whole issue of sustainability, I think, especially in the developing world, comes down to not so much building and flying your own satellites, is to learn how to effectively use assets in space. And that's a whole focus of the UN, as well as other organizations like the WMO, World Meteorological Organization. And they send people into these countries and say, okay, here's some satellite data that you can get for free that helps you determine which parts of your crops need water, or how your river is flowing, so you don't have flash floods. I've seen other things like demonstrations of telemedicine, where there are doctors in the developed world that are talking in real time to surgeons in a developing country, guiding them through some real delicate surgical procedures. I've seen, there was a company that won an award several years ago, and I'm going to totally botch the French. There was something like Télécom Sans Frontières, and they're a nonprofit that goes into parts of the world where there may be a revolution, or there may be an uprising, and big telecom companies donate satellite transponder times. They donate phones and receivers, and you can find videos online of how they reunite families on both sides of the border, just by linking them up by SATCOM. And I mean, if nothing else, that type of capability and that type of benefit to the world really ought to inspire the current and next generation.
Definitely, because those are the kinds of activities we're trying to preserve. Sorry, I missed out Stephen Marley's question. And he says, in addition to space traffic management and space situational awareness, he's a NOAA affiliate. What other aspects of operations in space need to be addressed now that commercial use is proliferating? So he uses the example of frequency management. So what other areas, are important to consider, Mark?
Well, it's certainly spectrum. I think several companies are developing autonomous collision avoidance systems, and along the lines of Daimler-Benz, those types of autonomous flight systems, at least the algorithms, really need to be shared with everybody else in the neighborhood. There are other examples for if you have an anomaly with your spacecraft and you can no longer control it, you need to tell people, especially if you're a third of a degree apart in the geostationary belt. And I think too, the whole science of debris characterization, I think, is going to be more and more important. And I use the example that if I'm driving down the 401 and I see an object in the road a half a mile ahead, I would like to know whether that's a plastic grocery bag or a leaf spring off a truck, because given those two situations, I'll probably take a different approach to how I deal with it. So I think characterizing debris on that gross scale, I think would be helpful too.
What about you, Stuart? Do you see any other aspects of operations that need to be addressed now commercial use is proliferating?
I hope this addresses the question, but I take it from a North Star's perspective in terms of what we're trying to do, rather than state what maybe governments or policymakers should do. I think you've touched those points well with spectrum and allocation of that spectrum and other things. But I would say that, space historically has been for the few that can afford access to it, and for the few that can know how to process the data that comes from it. North Star's objective in monitoring the environment in space extends to Earth, and with hyperspectral imagery and infrared imagery of the Earth to be able to monitor the health of crops, the quality of water, the quality of our oceans, life in the oceans. There's a heavy lift that's associated with understanding the raw data that could come out of a satellite so that somebody could make use of it and benefit that in a developing country. And what North Star is about, from a commercial perspective, is to develop tools and a platform to contextualize the data so that it is more easily and readily processable for decision making for a larger population. So more people can have access to this, whether they have it directly through North Star or whether it's embedded in their tractor that they're driving around their field and they don't even know that it's North Star data that's doing that. Contextualizing the data so that it's readily available in near or real time allows everyone to benefit from the access that we are preventing and preserving in space. So I think that's an important aspect, is that space is not just for the few that can afford it, or for the PhDs in hyperspectral imagery that have $1 million or $2 million worth of equipment to be able to process the data. It's for everyone to benefit, and developing a platform and having applications that people can develop on that platform, so that now through your iPad or through your phone, you can monitor environmental things that are of concern to you, and you can benefit from that capability. It's not just for the few. I think that's an important aspect for me.
Yes. And we're coming up to the top of the hour, and I think that's such a fascinating place to close, because space started off with two actors, the USSR and the US. Today it has proliferated. There are over 90 countries who are part of space governance. In Africa alone, there are 17 countries that have launched assets into space. So this is really something that's going to become even bigger in the future. And thinking about how we make sure that this continues sustainably is going to be a priority for everyone. And I just want to end by saying, the space industry agrees that we're free to explore space, subject, of course, to the Outer Space Treaty. But as Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty highlights, the freedom of outer space is subject to the condition that space be explored and used for the benefit and in the interest of humanity. And so in this case, what is benefit? Who gets to decide? And to do this, we must promote dialogue to ensure that space activities are and continue to be beneficial for all of humanity. And to do that, humanity have to be part of the conversation. So that is the purpose of this series that North Star basically launched, to launch a series of these conversations that bring in the general public. This is just the first of the series, so join us for many more. Please send us your questions, send us your comments, send us your feedback so that we can incorporate them into the future. And we hope to keep this conversation going. So I would just like to say thank you so much, Mark, for your time. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Stuart, for creating this great company that gives us the opportunity to have this conversation. And thank you so much to all our guests on YouTube for all your comments and for your engagement. Thank you so much.
Thank you.